Please join me in thanking Minister Lemaire and Secretary-General Gurria for that warm welcome and incredible overview of so many of the policy issues that we're going to be covering in the next couple of days. I'm Caroline Malcolm, head of the OECD's Blockchain Policy Centre, and I'm very glad to be hosting the second OECD Global Blockchain Policy Forum. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Leanne Kemp to the stage. Leanne, you can join us, please. Leanne is the founder and CEO of Everledger, which began their work looking at how to improve transparency in the diamond industry, using blockchain to record and trace a diamond's origins, characteristics, and ownership. Since that initial work has been underway, they've begun to extend into many other interesting projects in supply chains and beyond. But on that note, I leave Leanne the floor.
Thanks so much. Okay, super. Doubt. It's a wonder of human evolution. It forces us to think twice about drinking the Kool-Aid. Doubt proves that the earth isn't flat and the stars aren't made of fire. It's progress. It's enlightenment. It keeps our world skeptical and dynamic. Doubt makes us fair and balanced and open. It's a prerogative of the old rather than the young. A rare vintage aged by humility and experience of the complexities of human nature, as well as knowledge of the way history throws up grim patterns that generations down the track simply forget. Doubt is twinned with a questioning of certainty, exactitude, and judgment. Quite simply, the more you learn, the wider your world, the more you realise you simply don't know. Recent events have contributed to the declining trust levels in major public and private institutions across much of this world. The same institutions are now in a position where they will be forced to rethink their current trust facilitating models, and the new proliferation of new trust-enabled technologies will further change how trust is facilitated and maintained in a digital age. The question I ask myself is, will traditional institutions overcome their trust inertia in time? In recent years, society has struggled under the tremendous acclamation of trust breaches from institutions whose core purpose, ironically, is to serve as facilitators and safeguarders of trust. And two events have shaped the financial system over the past 10 years: the global financial crisis and the rise of crypto finance ecosystems, some who bashfully and broadly label it as fintech. Both of these events have raised questions about the appropriateness of regulatory response, and if not just a response, but a cry for reform. The lessons learned after the crisis have been widely discussed and regulatory response broadly agreed upon, even though it's not yet fully implemented. The Basel III framework is a simple example of this. However, the answer as to whether or how to regulate is still in the early stages and is a topic of ongoing policy debate, hence the imperative and timing and the commitment of the OECD in its continued deliberate actions. It comes as no surprise that the acclaimed annual trust survey published by Edelman shows that the citizens' trust in government, business, media, NGOs is at a hovering all-time low around the world. An implosion of trust was the dire summary of the 2017 edition in the Trust Survey, and we still live with it today in 2019. So how do we create and move a new trust paradigm? Do we have one in the making? Modern society has largely arisen based on the development of trust in centralised systems and institutions, and historically this has happened with the growing centralisation of state power and the associated development of judicial, monetary and other systems that made it possible to outsource trust to individuals and institutions. Nations with strong and transparent institutions generally have higher levels of trust, while nations struggling with widespread corruption experience the opposite. In other words, trust is a pivotal part of social contracts that we rely upon as a foundation of our societies and our economic models. But for a valid social contract to be upheld, citizens must fundamentally have trust in the institutions or the technology to keep that society running. And arguably, to participate in today's global economy, ordinary people must accept an asymmetrical bargain. Their lives are transparent to states and banks and corporations, whereas the behaviours and the inner workings of the powerful actors are kept hidden. The boundaries between consumers and the citizens have become irreversibly blurred. While most institutions have evolved over time, they still function in the essence as trust middlemen. Today's established institutions and systems have almost a de facto monopoly on the facilitation of trust across most layers and levels of society. The contours of new trust paradigms are beginning to emerge, where trust is created and maintained in new ways. We no longer need trust as much in opaque central authorities, global commercial monopolies, or other middlemen to manage our trust mechanisms. The combination of declining trust in established actors and systems, as well as the rise of emerging trust-enabled technologies, is as much a tech-savvy, vocal, activist, young generation movement as it is sitting in this room here today. We are moving towards a paradigm of trust. As we all know, the promise of new trust-enabling technologies, the latest technical developments driving potential revolutions in trust facilitation, blockchain, digital ledgers, is clearly the most well-known. You know, I chuckle as Everledger. We're considered a pioneer, a swashbuckler, a maverick in the eyes of industry, but we're 4 years old. Yet I'm considered somewhat of a veteran in the sphere of blockchain. And arguably, blockchain has become one of the most hyped technologies in recent years, and it's the most enthusiastic proponents claim that the technology has the potential to change the world to the same extent that the internet changed communications. And I do believe it to be true. We are moving from what we once knew was the World Wide Web to the World Wide Ledger. The most important conceptual advantage of DLT technologies and blockchain is, of course, the distributed element. And today, the creation of trust in society is for the most part linked to centralised actors who have, in many instances, proved to be untrustworthy and opaque. With the connective tissue of society dutifully bound to a DLT system, or even that of an industry like the diamond industry, the creation of trust is shifted to the technology and a distributed network of users who ensure transparency and immutability as at the core of their value systems. Not just value economic, but values. In theory, of course, this makes it possible to take the central actor, such as a bank or a lawyer or a social media platform, entirely out of the trust equation. The incentive for a break with a centralised middleman is also amplified by the fact that they are often expensive, burdensome, and in some instances no longer inspire the required trust or confidence. The movement is well underway. It is considerably more difficult to restore trust than it is to maintain it. There is no short path to regaining trust once lost, and perhaps trust in the established trust systems will suffer a declining blow in the near future. Concurrent with the rise of new alternatives such as this technology and the continued trust inertia that is established by institutions. It may be difficult to imagine how new ways of registering and storing information in a distributed ledger can bring about massive change in social order, and we're seeing this in the diamond industry. After all, the trust solutions of the future will not immediately topple society's established trust facilitation institutions, but they will force traditional institutions to overcome their trust inertia and to reinvent themselves with the help of the very same trust enablement technologies that we all work on today. Blockchain has the potential to revolutionise sectors and ecosystems amongst parties with misaligned interests. It's precisely within these contexts, however, that deploying such new and complicated and complex technologies can be very difficult. providing increased efficiency and transparency and interoperability across supply chains has been one of the most fertile areas for blockchain experimentation, illustrating both the opportunities and the challenges in realising the transformative potential of this technology. In most cases, projects, not platforms, projects, have come about as the result of efforts of one or two parties primarily focused on their own interests, without taking into consideration the unintended consequences or the downstream effects on other parties or on the system as a whole. The result is a fractured system that leaves behind parts of the sector whilst capturing economic efficiencies, gaining for other actors within the ecosystem. In fact, the hyper-focus on efficiency gains can reinforce existing mistrust or competition and undermine or even block the transformation that blockchain technology has the potential to bring about. I'm calling out the coalition of the willing to form a community and convene a broad multi-stakeholder community to co-design governance frameworks to accelerate the most impactful uses of blockchain in supply chain systems in a manner that is strategic, forward-thinking, globally interoperable, and by which countries across economic spectrums will be able to benefit. Since system-wide blockchain deployments will likely be accompanied by significant disruptions across industry, the deployment of this technology requires careful consideration of the unintended consequences, as well as measuring to ensure that the narrow, unscalable and bilaterally designed solutions do not dominate marketplaces. Frameworks need to be developed to ensure that diverse stakeholders can utilise the unique qualities of blockchain to create trust in an environment that is prone to mistrust. Moving beyond prototypes and pilots with relevant stakeholders, systemic changes need alongside iterative-based learning models, and then we need to disseminate broadly for international adoption. Frameworks can be applied to create a systemic global approach to the deployment of blockchains that allow for variability, but it is not tied to a specific supply chain system. And that ensures that we need to help all players in an ecosystem and be considerate of their systems' transformations. You know, advances in technologies are often referred to as disruptive innovations and have changed people's lives. I'm Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur and I sit under the Minister for Innovation, and undoubtedly our state have led in better services and qualities of products being offered to our consumers today because we understand that it's not disruptive, it's co-evolution. The world has become more integrated and more inclusive because of liberalisation and globalisation. And blockchain catapulted as the poster child for the fourth industrial revolution and facilitates the growth of what is namably disruptive technologies. Although many innovations are contributing to the digital space, empowering economies and communities, they also raise legal and regulatory concerns around the world. So in light of this, we must understand that the market should be balanced so that competition does not suffer at the cost of regulating disruptive technologies. And further, governments should encourage innovation whilst protecting the interests of consumers and their citizens. Several technology disruptions have raised questions about the efficacy of the current legal and regulatory frameworks around the world. And some common digital innovations include artificial intelligence and drones and Internet of Things, blockchain distributed ledgers that includes cryptocurrencies and smart contracts, regtech and big data. We are all bucketing together to understand how we are able to best regulate. These technologies have betrayed the traditional business and regulatory models, which thus calls for an in-depth study, a commitment to understand the modus operandi in order to frame effective legislation. Technology alone will not solve our problems, and it really doesn't matter which industry we're in. Rather, I think it's a function of being human. How can we stay warm at night and ward off the animals? We invented fire. How can we move things easier? We invent the wheel. How can we make lunch quicker? We invented sliced bread. The desire and the actual need to find more efficient and more consistent means of taking care of business have driven human imagination and the wheels of commerce since the start of time. And even though these overused examples, they have one thing in common. They started with a defined problem. They asked, what are we trying to solve for? Truly immersive technologies champion the challenge and follow the objective. Yet too many times, amidst the plethora of technology solutions, opportunities available to us, people confuse the technology with the solution. My life and our work with blockchain in Everledger is quite simply an exercise in fact-based dreaming. The imagination of a world where blood diamonds are featured as a fictional sequencing of a creative arts rather than the extended reality of our world. With over 2.5 million diamonds on the blockchain, we know and understand and we have measurable impact. So what is the future of our world and where does this technology lie? I guess we start to think and imagine not only the traceability from a supply chain from the source of its origin, but we do understand now that we're consuming 1.7 times planets of natural resources. We will start moving from natural mining to urban mining. And the most simplistic way to explain our predicament is to probably channel my Year 9 science teacher. Blockchain is able to bring parts of the next generation together, to bring a framework of trade and ethical platform to enable the fairness across rising economies and suffering communities. You know, I had a part of my speech that I wanted to talk about climate change, but it's often difficult to do so in an environment like this today when it's so heavily progressed. But I will channel it for a moment, so please stay with me. You know, carbon is a miraculous building block, and for centuries our planet has been a part of a natural carbon cycle. Some gets released, some gets stored, and if this becomes balanced, then equilibrium is maintained. Now, since the Industrial Revolution, we've broken the balance. We've been dramatically increasing the release of Earth-stored carbon into our atmosphere. And for hundreds of thousands of years, we've hovered over 180 to 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But since the Industrial Revolution, that number has shot up to over 40%, a staggering 420 parts per million, trapping heat in our atmosphere. And more than 90% of that excess heat is being trapped and absorbed in our oceans. The oceans are absorbing much of the carbon dioxide, and we are now increasing to more than 30% acidity rates than what we had 150 years ago. This is dramatically impacting biodiversity. Many sea creatures, such as oysters and clams, are struggling to make good shells. And being from Queensland, the home of the Great Barrier Reef, there's nothing closer to me, my heart and my community than understanding this impact in our own backyard. The increased heat, acid and energy in the system is also leading to more intense weather events. Hotter air can hold more moisture, so rainfalls, storms, hurricanes, floods and even snowfalls become heavier. I'm standing in for the Premier of Queensland today because she had to depart on a flight 4 hours ago because our entire state is on fire. It's true. Climate has always been changing. However, it's simply not been changing this rapidly with this much ferociousness in at least 50 million years. And unfortunately, the increase in heat also means our polar caps and glaciers are rapidly melting, which causes sea levels to rise and affects millions of people in coastal areas along Pacific Island nations. Our Earth is a collective home. We are renting it from future generations. We not only need to rapidly reduce emissions, we need to find new ways to sequester it or to draw down the excess carbon and put it into the atmosphere. When I began Everledger, I asked the question, where does it come from? And we know. We know where the diamond comes from, or the emerald, or the ruby, or the sapphire. But the big question for me now, given that we consume 1.7 planets of natural resources, we have problems with plastics in our oceans, aluminium cans, where does it go to after it leaves me? It's not good enough that we're digging a hole and putting it into our landfills. How can we trace and track supply chains, not only from its source and its origin, but what happens after first-time consumption? Blockchain is the engine driving the world's to-do list, and this tool has become the fueling of our strategic horizons. So I finish. It's in with my life's meaning, a desire to show what the world would look like if we can uncover the very best of converging and exponential technologies, innovators and solutions. And the burning question for me about blockchain is, rather than questioning the future, the what if tomorrow with these technologies, what would the world look like if we just embraced the very best of what exists today? Thank you.
What I love about Leanne is just she's got this incredible technical background, and yet she's also able to set out a vision that she just did